Welcome back to the class. We are continuing the discussion on feminist theory and Indian sociology. And in the previous class, we had a discussion on an essay by Professor Raiprol. And in today's class, we are going to discuss an essay written by Professor Sujatha Patel, a very important and eminent Indian sociologist, titled Feminist Challenges to Sociology in India, an essay in the disciplinary history. If the previous essay by Aparna Raiprol looked into the contributions of feminist epistemology in research, Sujata's essay is more on the impact of feminism on Indian society, or on Indian sociology, and the kind of changes that it brought in. So it's again published in Contributions to Indian Sociology, one of the very eminent journals in sociology. She begins this essay by looking into some of the important recent debates in the international scene about how some of the recent debates and scholarly interventions have brought in renewed attention to questions of gender and reflexivity. By 1980s, it is obvious to the new generation of sociologists that there was little to gain by discussing sociology as study of a sui generis system of society. So I hope you know this meaning of sui generis. It's a term made popular, French term made popular by Durkheim, who believed that society is sui generic, that is, it has its own existence and it has to be studied. Or when Durkheim made that kind of an argument, it was revolutionary, it was path-breaking, because till then the social was never recognized as having its own individual existence. So that's how the sociology as a discipline emerged. But now that assumption that society has somehow automatically come to its own independent existence is no longer accepted, or no longer it's no longer productive. Rather, it was argued that sociology should now be presented as a specific intellectual project emerging out of the process of modernization put in place in Europe, and was reimagined to be a study of the negativities and the discontinuities that organized modernity's emergence and consolidation. And this is a very interesting way to reimagine the history or the very relevance of sociology itself, because sociology is seen as a product of modernity. Okay, so why that sociology emerged in Europe during the 19th and 20th century it has to be answered by looking into the larger picture of the emergence of modernity itself. Okay, so it has argued that sociology should now be presented as a specific intellectual project emerging out of the process of modernization put in place in Europe, and was reimagined to be a study of the negativities and discontinuities that organized modernity's emergence and consolidation. This redefinition was critical because it allowed contemporary sociologists to initially question the perspectives and the overall array of the European thinkers called the classical sociologists, who it was thought had originally defined the discipline's conceptual frame, orientation and research question. This questioning led them to relook at some of the thinkers and the theories such as George Simmel and Norbert Elias, together with the early debates on Frankfurt schools and reframe perspectives on regarding modernity. This new conceptual architecture accepted the fact that there are many differences in pre-modern structures within Europe. Okay, and thus there may be similar differences across the world, and by implication in various projects of modernity emerging across the world. Because when you talk about European modernity, the Europe moving from feudalism to capitalism, or from medieval period to modern period, from tradition to modernity, we all tend to assume Europe as a singular, similar homogeneous entity. Okay, but the experience of European modernity is quite diverse. If the experience of European modernity itself is diverse, then it is quite natural for us to understand that the experience of non-European societies could be equally diverse. Okay, because you might know that it has created a lot of discussions and debates about multiple modernities, alternative modernities, and similar kind of debates. So some suggest that this latter process manifested itself in forming liquid identities. She's invoking Bowman, thereby promoting transient, unstable and fluctuating projects of agency. Yeah. So basically she brings in the centrality of modernity into the whole debate. This trend, sometimes termed as governmentality and biopolitics, has enhanced, according to some, the increasing use of the legitimization or violence of citizens by the state and between citizens and across states. And this is again how modernity also brought in the mechanisms of nation state, which brought in the era of governmentality and biopolitics, Foucault's argument about biopolitics and all these things. These theorizations were associated with two further developments, one of which can be characterized as methodological. This led to the epistemological and philosophical questions of sociology's practice, such as how best to study humans. Do we need evidence from all aspects of society to understand social life and its sociology inherently, and is sociology inherently interdisciplinary? What counts as evidence? Are social sciences argument of the same weight and validity as of natural science? How does one marry methodologically the particular with the universal? What is explanation? What is the relationship of science with normative and moral questions? These are some of the important debates within methodological and other aspects. The other development can be named as a critical and praxicological, which asked, how does the social science help to transform society and provide a good life? What is a good life? So, the kind of questions about what is the use of the discipline and other things. So, in this section, she is talking about some of the larger debates about sociology, which has kind of revised some of the early modernist positions. In this article, I wish to analyze the changes that took place in the field of sociology in India in the late 70s and particularly in the 90s and 1990s. It is my contention that the discipline of sociology in India has gone through a catalytic changes in these decades in a fashion similar to, but not same to, the narrative given above the case of North America and Europe. I suggest that in India, the feminist integration of the analysis of the domains associated till then with sociology of family, caste and religion has played a critical and important role in redefining the field. Prior to this interrogation, sociology in India conceived itself as investigating the structures and institutions of family, caste and religion, which is defined as being traditions, and so itself studying the changes occurring in them as a consequence of the introduction of modernity. Okay, so this is her core argument that from 1970s onwards, the feminist intervention has redefined discipline, because till then sociology was preoccupied with the study of family, caste and other things, and the changes were seen as the transformation of traditions in that. My argument is that the feminist studies in the guise of women's studies presented a theory of modernity, thereby displacing the existing perspectives regarding tradition modernity in India. By establishing gender as a category and linking it to the theory of patriarchy, it made visible the dominant class and caste orientations of the Indian project of modernity and argued that modernity was not value neutral, suggesting thus a need not only to interrogate the conceptualization of traditions, that is, the representation of the institutions such as family, caste and religion, but also to develop a critical language to examine this. So, this is a very important claim that she is making, that women's studies brought in gender as we mentioned in the previous classes as an explanatory paradigm, which really wanted to look at these structures, social structures. So, it's not only a mere transformation from tradition into modernity, but how these structures themselves are kind of constituted. Feminists argued that these traditions were invented and not inherited from the past. Rather, they were contemporary in nature and character, had been articulated and organized during the colonial period, both by the colonial state in and through legal interventions and the nationalist movements. These were reasserted in post-independence policies and programs. So the argument, so it's a kind of a questioning of the presentation of certain thing as traditional, as immemorial, as as unchanging, and so that these very basic assumptions themselves were a kind of questioned by these feminist scholars who very critically looked at the period of colonial intervention and how certain categories were crystallized, certain categories were made more tangible through their interventions. Before I frame the particulars of my argument, let me present some caveats. I use the phrase feminist studies very deliberately, although I recognize that in India, feminist studies were presented to its audience as women's studies. For me, feminist studies are studies that include reflection, research, and teaching about the way power organizes the relations of gender as they intersect with caste, class, ethnicity, sexuality, nation, and region, ability, and other differences through its structures and institutions. So this is her Patel's own take on how she defines feminist studies. The practitioners of women's studies in India in the mid-1970s conceptualized women's studies in this way and thereby distinguished it from the pre-mid-1970s perspective that engaged with women's question. The post-mid-70s focused squarely on women's subordination, unlike the earlier position which highlighted their evolutionary inclusion in the process that made modern India. The practitioners of women's studies have noted many of these achievements as being steps of formulation of this discipline and its institutionalization in India. Neera Desai and Krishna Raj Majumdar. However, I would like to suggest that these achievements also reframed the discipline of sociology in India and shook it out of its slumber, particularly its epistemic location within the colonial discourse. I am not suggesting this only because the main actors organizing women's studies in India were by and large sociologists or anthropologists or were influenced by sociological concerns. Neither I am arguing that this was because in large number of cases women's studies departments found their homes in the departments of sociology in various universities in India. So but she is putting forward the argument that sociology underwent a significant transformation with the introduction and infusion of feminist ideologies and feminist scholarship. An entire generation of sociologists and anthropologists grew to view themselves as feminists and as sociologists and anthropologists. This work of the first and increasingly the second generation has slowly and surely changed the discipline of sociology, initially through the unobtrusive and silent steps, and in the last decade or more through their extensive publications and roles played by them as leaders of and in these departments. So she considers this mid-1970s as a point of departure in which the discipline of sociology itself underwent significant transformation by the influence of the feminist scholars. Now, feminist challenges to sociology. When its precepts started chipping away slowly at sociology's self-defined boundaries, the latter started incorporating some aspects of gender analysis. She talks about how sociology was faced with immense pressure from the women's studies to look into this important dimension. Srinivasa's sudden interest in the dowry question can be cited as an example of such incorporation. However, the fact that the radical content of women's studies provoked one male sociologist from the discipline to make a frontal attack. This is about Gupta. I think we came across this point even in Sharmila Rage's thing where she talked about how two very important Indian sociologists, including Deepankar Gupta and Andre Bete, were rather, especially Gupta was kind of dismissive of the potential of women of feminist studies, and that his writing created a lot of uproar and backlash from the women scholars. And whereas Bete was of the argument that this excessive focus on women, or a kind of feminist focus would render sociology kind of more ghettoized, that you look into them exclusively without having a kind of a broader kind of a positions. Before we proceed any further, it is needed to make another caveat. It is important to accept that the field of sociology, as in other disciplines, through referred to in singular is so she talks about how sociology is different and how it is diverse and others. Thus, there is a diversity in terms of integration of the feminist concerns within these different perspectives. While some perspectives such as Marxism have been more open to feminist concerns, others such as structural functionalism have been less so. So talks about how within sociology certain theoretical traditions are more open and acceptable to the kind of feminist interventions. I have already indicated that the main achievement of feminist women's studies has been to present an alternative theory of modernity, and its main contours have been outlined above. To reiterate, this theory argued that the capitalist social change was inaugurated in and through colonialism. And these changes brought about new forms of inequalities between various groups and between men and women in India. That colonial state, with the help of the indigenous middle class elites, reconstituted these inequalities by creating new discourses of traditions and traditionalism that legitimized new hierarchies, and that this discourse came to be inscribed in law and various policies of the colonial state, and also ironically became part of the consciousness of the nationalist Indian elite, thus getting legitimized as a way to present women's question in pre-independent India. Okay, so this is her central thesis that the feminist scholars were able to present or able to kind of question this uncritical acceptance of certain things as traditional. In the theory of modernity, this theory of modernity, I'm arguing, has changed the epistemic concerns of what constituted sociology in 4 different ways. So that is what her central argument. It introduced a notion of power as central to the assessment of all relationships, and argued that the women's question should be located and understood in terms of distribution of cultural, political, and economic resources. As a consequence, sociology in India had to grapple with the concept of power, which was not even recognized, leave alone theorized. Okay? Even today, the specialization of political sociology, she says, is more or less absent. Then, see, this is something important, and I think it may not be fair to look at Indian society alone, because power as a central category in social science was recognized again globally much later, especially with the intervention of Foucault and Gramsci. Of course, there was understanding about a Weberian notion of power existed, but a preoccupation with power and the realization that power and knowledge are very intrinsically connected. They're all the products of post 1980s scenario with Edward Said and other people. So this concern that social institutions are not automatic, or social institutions are not naturally constructed. Okay, they are not natural, they are not given. Okay, rather they are the reflections of very specific power relations, was almost absent in the imaginations of scholars of the initial periods in India. They looked into tradition, they looked into change, they looked into ancient India, they looked into kind of a transformation, but how each of these categories constituted by power was almost absent from their arguments. So now feminist studies intervened in the domain of power in 3 levels. At the substantive level, in terms of an assessment of the structures of distribution of resources and assessment of the political system that organized formal power. But its most important contribution was in laying bare the nature of power in the private invisible domain, in the family, household, and kin system, in the organization of sexuality. So this work kind of looked into not only the kind of a larger structures of power, but also the places where this micro power works in say intra-family relationships, within the domestic spaces and others. Secondly, by connecting power and knowledge, feminist theories gave a theory of relating everyday ideas and practices with ideologies and consciousness. It again, for example, there are a lot of criticism about how many of our textbooks are extremely sexist. The examples given in the textbooks are only to reinforce the kind of gender stereotypes. Okay, you must have seen quite a lot of such examples where the picture of a household is presented as father reading newspaper and mother washing the dishes, or different sex roles assigned to boys and girls. So these kind of questions, these kind of things came under increasing criticism because the connection between power and knowledge was recognized. Third, it argued that knowledge itself is power, and interrogated the epistemic and methodological moorings in the field. As a consequence, not only were the methodological assumptions of value neutrality and that of ethnographic distance promoted by sociology and social anthropology questioned, but the framing of the entire corpus of sociological knowledge and its assumptions was also questioned. So this is again something that we mentioned earlier, the kind of how knowledge is produced itself is an articulation of power. Okay, so the claim that certain knowledge is pure, certain knowledge is objective, certain knowledge is scientific, as if it is not influenced by extra scientific concerns or extra intellectual concerns is only it is impossible. It never happens in that way. So those understandings, the Foucauldian, Seidian understanding of knowledge production heavily influenced this particular dimension as well. The second aspect related to the first, whereby a sense of time and that of its theory and methodology was introduced. An engagement with the theories of Marxian history and historiography was central to the quest of feminist studies in their endeavor to comprehend women's subordination in India, and wherein lies the most significant challenge that feminist studies presented to the contemporary sociological discussion in India, which promoted a ahistorical epistemology. Okay, so how a kind of a historical consciousness is something important was again a product of this intervention. Although a sane history and a form of evolutionism, a sense of history and a form of evolutionism was something that was always present in sociological discussion, whether on caste, religion, or family and kinship. This was enmeshed in Orientalist methodologies, and thus the notion of past, which was located in ancient India. And she gives the example of Gurye as representing the image of India having a distinct past as a kind of a concrete entity, and how Gurye and a host of scholars of that particular age presented pictures like that. Gurye's sociological overview was located within what is now known as a traditional nationalist discourse, a discourse that valorized the ancient past as a way to construct and understand the present, and thus to build a new future for India. Okay, so this again, you must be knowing that this is a part of a larger discourse which has become more powerful now, saying that we had a glorious past, and that past got ruined in between due to external influences and external aggression, and the immediate task at hand is to regain that lost glory. So these voices are becoming more and more louder and forceful now. For the traditionalist nationalist intellectuals from which mainstream sociology drew, including Gurye and others, it is precisely the present, given the colonial experience, from which we feel we must escape. As a result, the desire to be creative and search for new principles of modernity were now transposed to the past of India, a past ironically organized in and through the Orientalist methodology. So this is again part of a larger debate that this construction of the past, okay, this imagination of the past is a very, very modern idea. It's a very modern idea. It is realized through the tools and techniques and discourses that are available in the era of modernity. So our imagination of an unchanging past is specifically a modern imagination enabled by the modern vocabulary, modern technology, and modern tools within modernity. No wonder Chatterjee suggests that these intellectuals construct a picture of those days when there was beauty, prosperity, and healthy sociability. This makes the very modality of our coping with the modernity radically different from the historically evolved modes of Western modernity. So that is something of a very specific thing that India has to deal with, and India still is dealing with. In a different way, historian Sumit Sarkar makes a similar argument when he suggests that while Western and modern history writing has generally been state-oriented with an understanding of nation as a reflection of the nation-state, the historical consciousness of Indian intelligentsia in the late 19th and early 20th century was oriented to the valorization of culture against the state. So, Indian these nationalist scholars have a very, very problematic association with the with the notion of state, especially the Mughal period. Is seen as in this accounts is seen as a era of decline, okay, of a very prosperous ancient Hindu tradition got declined during Mughal period and also during colonial period. So that kind of a contradiction emerges here. As argued earlier, feminist studies in India questioned and demolished the stereotype of and valorized traditions and exposed their moorings in covert and overt violence. Feminists made critique of the late 19th century reform movement and argued that this was limited to the discussion of the religious basis of these practices and on the fine points of scriptural interpretation, and legitimized the civilizing mission of colonialism and evangelism. So there are very, very fascinating work by a host of scholars who looked into the nature of social reformism of the 19th and 20th century, and how certain social reformist attempts were made, and what was the basis of such intervention. And ironically, all of them agree that it was very limited in its ambition. It to a large extent it helped in reifying Hinduism, okay, or modeling Hinduism after Christianity, or after Christianity, as if every social custom and culture of people are defined and decided by a religion. Okay, there are very fascinating studies by feminist scholars. Yeah, one of the studies that comes to my mind is the work by historian Lata Mani, who looked into the controversy associated with the banning of sati. So she is able to clearly tell that the interventions of the colonial state, involvement of Indian scholars, Indian reformist leaders, they were all revolved around the whole question of the religious legitimacy of this of sati. Okay, and in that way, essentially, they were imagining Hinduism as something identical to that of Christianity. Okay, and so the criticism here as well follows that kind of an argument. More particularly, the discussion on women's entitlement within the family system brought out a deep organic relationship between modern laws, colonial construction of religion, and framing of family in India. For sociology, this was a revolutionary intellectual intervention. Okay, particularly, discussion on women's entitlement within the family system brought out deep organic relationship between modern laws, colonial construction of religion, and the framing of family in India. So these are the studies that looked into a host of colonial interventions and in the familial and religious level. Not only did the orientation displaces the thesis of modernity of tradition, but also simultaneously recognize the fact that Indian modernity was inaugurated with colonialism. Feminists were asserting an argument which some Marxists have presented earlier. The discourse of tradition and the valorization of the principles of purity and pollution were organizing and legitimizing material and were constitutive of social process of inequalities within India. Even today, a significant number of sociologists find it difficult to state that India has been a modern society since the time of colonialism, and possibly even before that, where traditions have been reconstituted in many ways to legitimize control of women's bodies, actions, agencies, and representations of themselves. So this is a very, very important argument. The discourse of tradition and the valorization of principles of purity and pollution were organizing and legitimizing material, okay, and was constitutive of social processes of inequalities within India. So this whole discussions about tradition, notions of purity and pollution, and a host of other interventions were the reasons why the inequalities got perpetuated and constituted in India. Thus, the feminist studies have interrogated the intellectual insularity and had structured sociology as a discipline. After independence, sociologists in India had affirmed a need to have a sociological language that can comprehend the uniqueness of Indian nation and its culture and civilization. Sociologists in India saw their project as that which analyzes one's own society and nation in one's own terms, without colonial and neo-colonial tutelage. This project followed the institutionalization of a particularistic problematic, namely an assessment of the changes occurring within India's characteristic institutions such as caste, kinship, family, and religion. So a quest for an unmediated attempt, unmediated access to Indian society was something that was kind of required. This particularistic problematic had much in common with the notion of India embedded within the elite and thus mainstream nationalism. Hence, sociologists examined modernity and modernization and the changes occurring within the institutions of caste, family, kinship, and religion as part of the analysis of which they termed structure and change. So that was a preoccupation with which they kind of worked. As against this, the feminist studies opened up its theoretical discussions on new intellectual trends organizing contemporary social sciences such as structuralism and psychoanalysis, post-structuralism and post-colonialism, and showed awareness of the comparative process of subordination taking place in various parts of the world, particularly in the global south, something the sociologists and anthropologists have rarely examined. So, Sujatha Patel is always a very important advocate of the comparative sociology, okay, not focusing exclusively on a particular domain and then try to generalize, but try to see how similar processes take place in different region and to benefit from the kind of a comparison that is emerging. So additionally, as a consequence, a window to new ideas opened up because they were looking into Indian society by using a kind of a very innovative theoretical ideas. Additionally, feminists have also made comparative analysis of the regional and local variations of women's subordination within country, again a methodological innovation which contemporary sociology and social anthropology has not addressed. Some looking into comparative analysis of the regional and the local variations of women's subordination, okay, looking into different kind of a comparative framework. Because as we know, Indian sociology has been heavily influenced by British anthropology, okay, which which heavily depended on participant observation and extended ethnographic study to make sense of that. As a consequence, the third point, as a consequence, feminist studies argued that everyday practices organize women's subordination and that these were expressed and legitimized in and through various norms, values and ideologies, institutional structures, and that is intersected differently with class, caste, ethnicity, nation, religion and religion. Certainly, sociology in India had a notion of cultural diversity, but it had little to no intellectual resources to comprehend the diversities in and intersectional subordinations. So, her argument is it was the feminist intervention that actually brought in the point that we discussed earlier, the possibilities of intersectionality that brought in the myriad diversities of Indian experiences. So you can't really talk about the caste experience of a particular people. You can't talk about the Dalit experience in India in singular. Okay, so this multiplicity and sensitivity to this multiplicity, this diversity is something specifically a contribution of women's studies according to Sujatha Patel. And the fourth point is that as we know, sociological inquiry brings together three elements: order, change and action. When it analyzes the dynamics that interrelates action with order and change. Action becomes redefined in feminist thought when it linked subjectivities and experiences to agency. Okay, so how action is understood in feminist thing is when it is linked with subjectivities and experience to agency. So to what extent an individual is an owner of her own actions, she has ownership of her own body, her own sexuality, her own actions, her own dreams. These are important questions. In feminist studies, these subjectivities, also called narratives, were initially given epistemic privilege. However, when feminists interrogated women's involvement in dowry deaths and say in communal riots or in other kind of things, you realize that women, because they are women, do not really possess any say emancipatory or any progressive or any other kind of anti-oppressive kind of position. So she talks about how feminists were had to encounter with women's involvement in dowry deaths, women's involvement in harassment of other women, women's involvement in communal riot. Okay, so it's all kind of really challenges certain taken for granted essentialist ideas that women always stand for justice, women stand for emancipation, women stand for peace, love, all these things. So this has led some feminists to use post-structuralist analysis, while some others have reframed the problematic of agency. And yet others have raised fundamental issues regarding the organic connection between knowledge and power and agency and critical social science. Yeah. So in the conclusion, in an earlier contribution, Sujatha had argued that sociology in India had gone through major upheavals in the 1980s. In this article, I am suggesting that without feminist studies dethroning the main foundations of received sociological practices, the subsequent changes in the discipline that took place in the late 1980s would not have been possible. The displacement of traditional paradigm of family, kinship, caste, and religion led sociological tradition in India to reframe the discipline and introduce interdisciplinary ways of doing theories and new methodologies, allowing reflections on both the nature of modernity and contemporary institutional domination that organize social processes. This interrogation also created conditions in the late 1980s for the subaltern perspectives such as Dalit studies and tribal studies to mark their presence in the discipline and allowed insular, India-oriented sociological tradition to open itself to a dialogue with international and global traditions of social sciences. So she looks at it as a very decisive intervention, and how this it was something very fundamental in complicating India's engagement with modernity, and how this involvement, this intervention of feminist scholarship in Indian sociology really took it out, or enabled Indian sociology to come out from its very narrow worldviews and then be sensitive to the larger kind of idea. So this it's a kind of a concluding section. So this I hope you would have found it useful, because it looks at how these are all the similar themes and arguments. So you may not find much of a difference between the arguments, but they're all important interventions trying to chronicle and critically evaluate the relationship between feminist scholarship and Indian sociological tradition. We will discuss one more essay on almost a similar topic in the coming class. Okay, see you then. Thank you.